Welcome back to my studio. In this video, I will show you how I made my pannier for my Sakizou Cinderella dress. I modified Simplicity pattern 3635, and I tried to follow the pattern instructions the best I could. I did make some variations that I thought would be easier for me and to help me achieve the final product I was working towards. This undergarment took me 30 hours over about 5 days. A lot of that time was spent on the hooping channels. So, to start out, I pinned my front and back piece to my fabric and added 6 inches to the center front and back. This is so that I can get my pannier to be a foot wider than the intended size on the pattern. I've used this pattern twice before, and even though the size is great as is, to create the dramatic silhouette I am striving for, I decided to add a foot to the garment, and I'm very happy I did. I also had to modify the top triangular piece to line up with the front and back pieces, so I did that as well. I cut these out 4 times as directed on the pattern and then went ahead and pinned and cut out the side pieces. These did not have any modifications to them. Okay, so I just did my binding math, and essentially what I did was I took my tape measure and I measured every line that was on the pattern pieces, and I added 6 times 4, which is 24, to all of them because I added that 6 inches to the center front, and I cut that out 4 times. I didn't try to add any like seam allowance because the way I see it is if my binding is a few inches longer than like the piece, that's better than if it was shorter. So I'm gonna make it probably like 3 or 4 inches longer, but essentially what I have here is for the hip binding, I need 2 41-inch pieces, like strips, and then for the top binding, I need a 122-inch strip, a 136-inch strip for the second binding, a 152-inch strip for the third binding, a 172-inch strip for my fourth binding, and then I took that and multiplied it by 2.5 to get 430 inches for my ruffle. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out all of my binding, which by that I basically just mean my boning channels. I cut out strips of binding as my like boning channels, and then I sew them on because I did not buy twill tape for this. You can buy twill or ribbon to create the channels. I'm actually going to create the channels out of a cotton, and I'm not cutting it out on the bias, but I'm going to do a decorative stitch on top of it so that it is like basically made for this costume. So yeah, that's all my math. That's how I got there. For the ruffle, I haven't measured how long I want it yet, so I'm actually going to leave that for a little bit later. And I'm also taking note from something I did previously on this pattern, and that's to add a piece of hoop at the very, very bottom where the hem should be. So we're adding a piece of hoop and then a ruffle. So yep, that's the plan, and it was pretty easy to get to that point. My math has been figured out. I will be cutting 16 strips of 2-inch wide white cotton for my hooping channels. I do this with a ruler and my Quilters Select rotary tool. This really saved so much time for me, and I love it. Once my strips were cut, I can sew them together according to the hoop they will be for. I made sure to label all of my strips with water-soluble marker for this process so I could keep track of which one goes where. After sewing my strips together, I'm going to press all the seams in the same direction. This will allow me to move my boning through the channels easier. In order to stitch out my decorative stitch, I pinned strips of tearaway stabilizer to the wrong side of the cotton fabric. I chose a darker purple embroidery thread from Floriani as my thread for these using my Janome M7 Continental. I stitch out decorative stitch number 73. Every 44-inch strip took 5 minutes and 30 seconds to stitch out, and there were 16 strips of fabric to stitch out. So you can do the math.
3 hours later.
The last step to prep the hooping channels before sewing them was to press the sides down by 1/2 inch on each side. I did this after I already took the tearaway stabilizer off. Once I was done pressing these down, I just set them aside to focus on the main construction of the garment. This is where we're going to start following the directions on the pattern until I deviate from them again. So now it's time to mark everything. All the markings, all of them, on my fabric. I used water-soluble marker on the inside for all the markings there, and then a big change I am making on this pattern is to place the hooping channels on the outside because I wanted them to be a statement piece of this undergarment, so I marked the placement of them with chalk on the right side of the fabric. Step 1 in the instructions say press under hem allowance on long side edge of gusset. To form narrow hem, tuck under raw edge to meet crease. Press, stitch hem in place. And then I did this for all 4 gussets. Step 2 says to stitch gusset to upper edge of front in a flat felled seam, matching large dots. Stitch gusset to back sections in the same manner. I have an entire video on how to sew a flat felled seam, so I'm not going to go over the step-by-step for this video, but I will show one flat felled seam just to get the gist of it, and then all of the other flat felled seams, I believe there's 14 of them total, will be done off camera. Step 2 continued. It says to stitch center front seam below large dot, back stitch to reinforce seam. I stitched the seam at a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance to prep for the next step, and it worked out really well. I highly recommend doing it. Step 3 says narrow hem seam allowances above large dot, same as you did for gusset. Continuing to stitch under seam allowances of the center front seam. And this is why I did a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. It just gives me a little bit more wiggle room for this front seam. And I actually ended up doing all of my seams at 3/4 of an inch instead of 5/8 of an inch because it gives me just that little bit more fabric to work with while I fold over the fabric pieces. Step 4 says stitch center back seam of back in a flat felled seam. Press under 5/8 of an inch on upper edge of side. Stitch side sections to front and back in flat felled seams, matching large dots. Backstitch at large dot to reinforce seam. Hem lower edge of pannier, same as you did for gussets. So the only thing about this that I didn't do was the hem the lower edge, mainly because I was planning to add a ruffle. And this is where I begin to kind of deter from the instructions and start doing my own thing. But I did sew all of those seams with French seams with flat felled seams. So yeah. So now that all of the panels have been sewn together and I'm starting to get what looks like a very wide skirt, I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch bias tape around the top edge of the gusset. This is where I will feed the ribbon through later to tie the pannier around my waist. And this is actually a 1/2 inch double fold bias tape that I just made while I was cutting strips for the hooping channels. Starting from the bottom, I'm going to pin my hooping channels to my pannier. For the bottom hoop, I'm just going to go about 3/4 of an inch from the bottom hem. For all of the other channels, I'll follow the chalk markings I made before sewing my panels together. I chose to place the pins on each side of the hooping channel parallel with the channel. I've tried sewing these both with the pins perpendicular and parallel, and I just find this way is much easier for me, even if it was a bit slow. I really took my time sewing these channels down. I didn't want to have any issues with them, so even though I can sew faster, I chose to sew these at a slower pace, and I'm really glad I did because they stitched down beautifully.
One eternity later.
Now I'm going to go back to the pattern instructions for the ribbon ties, which is step 9 in the instructions, but I'm doing this before I add the boning because working on this garment after that step is so difficult. Here's what the instructions say. Cut 12 pieces of ribbon, each 30 inches long. On inside, hand sew ribbons to front and back sections at small dots. Fasten ribbons together as follows. For top ribbons, fasten ribbons together so the distance between front and back measures 18 inches. For middle ribbons, fasten ribbons together so the distance between front and back measures 20 inches. For bottom ribbons, fasten ribbons together so the distance between front and back measures 26 inches. And I actually sewed these down by machine, which made them much more durable than hand sewing them, although I'm sure if I did enough hand sewing, they would be as durable as the machine. This step was so much faster doing by machine than it ever has been by hand. So I'm glad I did it this way. All right, so now I will be moving on to the ruffle, which is not in the pattern at all, but it's something that I personally wanted to do. So at the beginning of construction, I decided on a 430-inch ruffle, which would be 10 strips of 44-inch wide cotton. I decided that a 10-inch long ruffle would be a perfect length for this ruffle, so I cut 10-inch strips of white cotton with my ruler and rotary tool. Once they were cut, I stitched all 10 strips together to create a very long strip of fabric. I do apologize for the poor lighting in the next couple clips. This is my first time sewing on this machine at night and the lighting is awful, so next time I will definitely have to set up my full studio lights. Now I will take my strip and press all the seams open, and then I will press and roll the bottom hem to prep it for being sewn down. For my next trick, I will show you 10 minutes of sewing in 10 seconds. To prepare my really long strip of fabric to ruffle down and attach to my pannier, I'm going to add a 3mm stitch along the top of the entire strip. Then, without backstitching, I'm going to add a basting stitch at 4mm length on every individual strip, leaving at least 3 inches of thread tail to pull for gathering. I decided to break this up into 10 sections for more even ruffles, but also to make the entire thing easier to gather by hand. Now I divided the bottom hem into 10 parts by taking the circumference and dividing by 10 to 16.5 inches and placing a pin every 16.5 inches. This would allow me to line up the ruffle seams with these pins and have a more distributed ruffle. Starting at the center front, I'm going to pin one seam and then the second seam to my first pin. To gather these down, I will pull the thread tails and push the fabric closer to the middle to have a better distribution of fabric. Then I will place several pins into the ruffled piece, pinning it to the pannier. I will repeat this process for every seam-to-seam piece of fabric until the entire strip is gathered and pinned. Finally, I can sew this ruffle down, making sure not to have any of the ruffled pieces get caught in the sewing machine where they're not supposed to, and also just being very careful of not sewing over pins and having them forever hidden into the ruffle. I have done that before. It's not fun when you find them because you're scratching yourself. To add the hooping wire, I have to first measure the channel and make sure to add 5 inches to that for the overlap in the channel. Then I can measure and cut my hooping wire. To cap the edge, I just fold duct tape over it. I've done this for every understructure I've ever made, and I've never had an issue with it, so I'm just going to keep doing it this way. Now I can feed it through the channel and the duct tape the overlap together, and then I push it through the channel so that the duct taped pieces together are well within the boning channel. All right, well, here we are in the pannier. It's done. I have a few things that I could tweak, but for the most part, because of how much wider I made it, there's a little bit of just like rippling here at the top because I took 88 inches and gathered them down to 28 inches. So it like creates this like ruffling up here, but I mean, I'm not against it. Yeah, I'm bigger than my mirror, so there's that. And then right here, there's these slits, and underneath I will have my historically accurate pockets. So I will get some footage on this, or of this on me with everything else at some point, but here we are. And there you have it. That's how I made my pannier for my Sakizou Cinderella cosplay. I will be doing one more addition to this. I have a Ko-fi goal right now to help raise money for the silk for this outer gown, and everyone that donates to the Ko-fi will get their name stitched out in the ruffle of this pannier. So if you would like to have your name in this gown, you can donate $3 or more to my Ko-fi. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next one, and happy sewing!